You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Vivienne Nunis. Today we're discussing the age-old problem of state pensions. How do you imagine life when you're 70? Are you gardening perhaps, looking after the grandkids, or cruising the Balearics and spending the inheritance? What if you're still working, clocking up your half-century in the office? That's how the future looks for the generation of young people entering the workforce today, thanks to the government's plans to tie the pension age to life expectancy. Some people say the move is well overdue, while others argue young people are once again being penalised, while the baby boomers get off scot-free. To discuss this, I'm joined by Professor Michael Dempster. He founded the Centre for Financial Research at the University of Cambridge. Malcolm Booth is the CEO of the National Federation of Occupational Pensioners. Angus Hanton is the co-founder of the think tank Intergenerational Foundation. And joining us on the phone is Philip Booth, Program Director at the Institute of Economic Affairs. Thanks everyone for your time. I'd like to start with you, Professor Dempster. You've researched pension systems around the world. You say the UK is a ticking time bomb heading for a pensions crisis. Why?
Well, because people are living longer and the government has noticed this, and because of the recent financial problems, and actually prior to that, problems in funding pensions in a pay-as-you-go system, meaning that those who work now are paying for the people who are retired now. That is demographically becoming a very difficult matter.
Isn't there an argument to say we're in sort of an anomaly at the moment, and historically people really did work until they dropped?
Yes, they did. In the agricultural economy, people did work until they dropped. But of course, we have a different economy now, and part of it is because of the nature of, for example, industrial work, which is, of course, becoming now going the same way that the agricultural economy did, at least in this country. And so now people feel, because their jobs are boring and not difficult, they prefer to relax. But, of course, the problem with the ever-increasing lifespans, particularly those who are actually not very well, this is increasing very rapidly, actually. So the statistics of this, that there are a smaller and smaller number of people carrying those who are retired, have to bring about some kind of change, and that's what the government is trying to respond to.
Malcolm Booth, I'll go to you. Do you agree we have to have a higher state pension age now?
I think the difficulty is that they're looking at longevity in terms of the reasons for changing it, which I can understand in all the economic background. But longevity doesn't necessarily equate to long-term well-being. And the risk is obviously that you're going to get a group of people who are unable to continue to work because of their physical conditions, but would not be qualifying for pension. So how do you support those people in that period of time?
Angus Hanton, you've said the 70-year-old retirement age should be brought in today. How do you equate that, though? Because isn't there a risk here that it's being taken for granted that longer life expectancy means more years at the tail end of our life to enjoy? But that's also the time when our bodies start to wind down. How do you match those two things up?
That's absolutely right. But what the government are doing in the UK by increasing retirement age on a very deferred basis is they're administering a policy which is unfair on younger people. If it's right to increase the retirement age, it's probably right to do it much sooner. And actually, we probably need to do it even more. But just on a technical point, that's a bit more than a technical point. It's not just we're not here really talking about retirement age. We're talking about pension age. Now, we need to separate those out because for different people, it's possible to work for longer or shorter times. So if you have a pension age at 70, it's quite reasonable that some people will retire before that pension age if they've got the means to, if that's possible financially. So people might retire at 65 with a pension age of 70, and equally they may well work beyond pension age, and 1.4 million people in the UK are currently doing so. So retirement age and pension age needn't be the same.
Philip Booth, do you want to come in there on the phone?
Yes, not only should we stop talking about retirement age, we should probably refer just to the state pension age rather than the pension age as such, because as has just been mentioned, it's possible for those with their own resources to perhaps bridge the gap between when they want to retire and the state pension age, but through private saving and purchasing an annuity, private income, and so on in the market. Now, I want to respond to the issue relating to the problem of, as we get older, we become more unhealthy. First of all, it's worth noting that we actually work for a shorter period and retire earlier, stop working earlier today than we did in the 1960s and 1970s. So if we could only get back to where we were in the 1960s and 1970s, that would be a good start. Not only that, as well as longevity increasing, the healthy lifespan is increasing as well. Now, of course, some people do become disabled, but this is a different problem, and it's a problem really which should not be solved by having a generally low state pension age. If we want to deal with problems of disability and people being unable to work and so on, we should deal with that either through state disability insurance schemes or, in my view, better with private sector disability insurance. But I think this change is long overdue. It's not happening quickly enough, and it's very important to link pension age to life expectancy to as much as anything to reduce the future risk of life expectancy increasing on future generations of taxpayers.
Professor Michael Dempster, you've studied this around the world. Is it looking ahead to 2020 to increase the state pension age to 66, or even 2060 to increase the state pension age to 70? Is that too late? Should we be bringing this in today?
Well, I believe yes. It should come as soon as possible. Because it's not independent of the business cycle and the particularly bad one we've seen recently. And I have some interesting statistics on who actually will be able to replace their standard of living upon retirement. And the answer is actually that the generation that is so-called Generation X is already at roughly the same replacement ratio as the generation that was born in the Depression. And the people who are best off actually are the early people who were born soon after the Second World War. Those who were born later in the 50s and 60s are actually not as well off as the early baby boomers, so to speak, and but they are themselves better off than Generation X and beyond. So that shows you the dependence really on the business cycle and general events in the world, both economic and more general, how this is a very complex question.
Angus Hanton, you're nodding your head there as the co-founder of Intergenerational Foundation. What's your view?
Well, one needs to get to the bottom of how rapidly life expectancy is increasing. Roughly every 12 months, life expectancy increases by 4 months. So if I'm, for example, 30 years younger than my father, my life expectancy is likely to be 10 years longer. And that'll apply to most people. So we've really got to get, as Michael says, got to get the idea that 70 is sort of bare minimum. But the other aspect of it is that the pension schemes, particularly the state pension scheme, but also the government employee pension scheme, they are a take-as-you-go, pay-as-you-go system where the government aren't putting aside money. And the liability is huge. For the state pension in the UK, there's about £3.8 trillion of accrued liabilities. That means over £100,000 per UK household of money that's sort of owed, or will be owed, for people collecting the state pension. So we've really made promises to ourselves on the chequebook of the next generation, and that's something that needs to be addressed.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Vivienne Nunis, and today we're discussing the government's plan to raise the state pension age to 70. Malcolm Booth, how do you feel about that?
I think there's another problem. I don't believe that the financial services industry is geared up at the moment to deal with the changes of replacing the incomes that people would need. I'm not altogether convinced that people are comfortable with saving for a pension. There's a lack of trust in financial services, and unless we address those fundamental issues now as well, there won't be the levels of income generated elsewhere, the ability to bridge the gaps between when a person wants to retire and when state pensions come into payment. And I accept the comments of the other guests in terms of where the funding is coming from, how it's going to work, and the cost that's going to create. But until there's a greater degree of confidence in what's happening, and I'm not sure that at the moment, with everything that's going on and all the proposals that are out there and the changes that are being made, people have that confidence. Until that confidence is restored in the market in terms of the provision of future pensions and provision of retirement income and other support that may have to come from the private sector, I think we're facing a very difficult situation because we have to change the expectations of the people who will be most affected by these decisions.
That is true, but we do have really quite a long planning horizon here. As Angus has said, this change is being phased in over a long period of time. Under the government's previous proposals, actually, life expectancy was increasing more rapidly than the government was planning to increase state pension age. Now, that's been pulled back somewhat. So first of all, we have a long planning horizon. Secondly, for all the criticisms that you get of private sector pension providers and so on, and perhaps we should debate that another day, but for all the criticisms you get, resolving the problem of bridging a gap between somebody's desired retirement age and the state pension age is a relatively easy problem for the financial services industry and for individuals to resolve. You don't need to use complex products. You can just use general saving. You don't have to necessarily link insurance to it, and so on. So I think actually raising the state pension age is a very good way to reduce the liabilities on the government, rather than, for example, general cuts in the state pension. Though I'd like to see that too. But if you raise the state pension age, it actually provides an opportunity for the financial services industry to come in and offer pretty simple products, which I'm sure would be quite good value and easy for people to understand and easy to use.
Yeah, is there not more of an argument for the private sector to get more involved here? I mean, some countries we have compulsory contributions for private pensions from employers, whatever job you're doing, however many employers they've got. Professor Dempster, you might know more about this. Isn't that a good idea for Britain?
Well, I'm not going to respond exactly to your question. I would like to support Malcolm's view. I mean, one of the problems is that people do not trust financial services at this point, just as they didn't in the late 30s and immediately after the war for exactly the same reason. Furthermore, it's a very complex matter, saving for your retirement. It's not trivial at all, and I don't agree with the previous speaker that it's a simple matter. Indeed, we have been developing systems to do exactly that, and they are very, very complicated, taking account of what is available from the private sector at this point.
Angus Hanton?
Well, one of the problems is that this whole business of raising pension age is to deal with the huge liability of pensions. But there are other ways of dealing with the liability of the state pension. One thing that the Australians have done is they've means tested the state pension. And we could do that in the UK. We've got a lot of really quite wealthy pensioners who are getting the state pension on top of a perfectly adequate pension from other sources. We've, at the Intergenerational Foundation, we've calculated that amongst the over 60s, there are 2 million people who live in households with over £1 million worth of assets. So it means testing the state pension would be one other way of reducing the liability, but it would also allow us to be more generous in terms of the state pension, which in the UK is one of the lowest pensions in Europe.
Philip Booth from the Institute for Economic Affairs, I want to ask you about that. Should the state pension be means tested?
To be honest, I'd rather move towards what I think is perhaps a closer interpretation of the Australian system than a means-tested state pension. That is, it's really a system of compulsory private pension provision with a state backstop for those who somehow slip through the net. And I would rather move to that sort of system. If you want to make commitments to future generations to provide them with an income, then those commitments should be delivered through capital markets, through investment, rather than through making promises that will be met by future taxpayers. Perhaps I could just make a point too about this whole issue of healthiness and working longer. There is quite a lot of evidence that suggests not only that we're living healthier, living to older ages and living healthier, that there's some recent evidence from the United States which suggests that periods of ill health are becoming more and more concentrated in the later part of our lifespan. But also there is a relationship too between working and healthiness in old age. The longer we work, not necessarily in paid activity, paid employment, but also in keep ourselves active through voluntary work too. The longer we work, the longer we stay engaged with the labour market, the healthier we tend to be. So there is actually a positive relationship between continuing working and healthiness in older age.
I'm going to put that to Malcolm Booth as the CEO of the National Federation of Occupational Pensioners. Is that something that your members would agree with?
Our members are fairly mature already, and there are some very active people within our organisation who are beyond the ages that we're talking about here and are very active and very alert and very capable of the things that they do. I was looking at some interesting parallels. If you're an airline pilot, you can't fly after 65. If you are a bus driver or a lorry driver or have a commercial licence, you have to renew your licence every year after you're 65. So there is a legislative suggestion that at the age of 65 and just beyond, there are issues in terms of individuals' ability to undertake certain roles. And I accept that perhaps people in an office-based function or working from home have the opportunity to work to whatever age they want. If you're in a more physically demanding role or where there is risk to other people, there are challenges there which need to be looked at and considered. And how do you look after those people in those specific roles? And again, everything that's been said has a degree of validity. Everything that's been said has some merits. It's when you introduce it in the lead times. And I think one of the concerns with the means testing suggestion is that if a person has planned their retirement based upon a promise that has been made to them by the state now, is it valid that that promise is broken at this stage? If we're going to change what the promise says and there's a leading time, perhaps that's acceptable. But to look at changing the promises that were made to a generation who have then followed the advice and the approach that government have put forward in terms of how they plan, are then being penalised for what they've done. I don't believe that that's fair.
Well, you're dealing with two unfairnesses here, aren't you? There's the unfairness of introducing it too speedily, and we're not really talking about promises here. We're talking about a welfare system, and it's a welfare system based on what we can afford. And the unfairness on the younger generation of asking them to support people in their retirement who are going to be retired for more than a third of their adult lives. So there are two unfairnesses, and I suppose what I'm suggesting is that we're leaning too much towards the interests of those who are currently about to retire and not enough towards future taxpayers. And that's a general policy problem, that we listen too much, I think, to the older generation and we don't think enough about the interests of the younger generation.
I would agree with that point. And I'd like to come back to the idea of private pensions in the capital markets, because the private pension idea was invented in this country roughly 200 years ago. Until about a decade and a half ago, we were actually in pretty good shape. I should point out, relative to Australia, that of the developed OECD nations, it is, because of this compulsory pension idea, and incidentally Chile has the same idea, most pensions are in fact privately funded, and they were in this country and in the Netherlands. In fact, we are still, both the Netherlands and the UK, are still better off from private funding relative to state funding than the United States, which is, I found, a bit surprising in the statistics. But this is a way to do it. But as I said before, this is a very complex, and I think that Malcolm raised the point of education, really. people don't want to think about the future. They don't even want to think about what they might want to do in 5 or 10 years. I mean, they get married, maybe they want a house, they're going to have children. That's about it. They don't want to fool around with money and things like that. And that's a major educational difficulty, and it's also a technical one, because to put together sources of income, some investment, salaries, so on and so on, childcare costs and so on, it's a very difficult problem. And to do that over the future is even more difficult. So I believe that technical aids for that are very necessary, and they are now starting to come, I believe. Well, certainly we're involved with one of them.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Vivienne Nunis, and today we're discussing the age-old problem of state pensions. I'm joined by Professor Michael Dempster, founder of the Centre for Financial Research at the University of Cambridge, Malcolm Booth from the National Federation of Occupational Pensioners, Angus Hanton from the Intergenerational Foundation, and Philip Booth from the Institute of Economic Affairs.
I think it's also worth noting in passing that the young are also discriminated against. Perhaps that's not quite the right word, but the young have huge pressures on them because of the cost of buying housing as a result of our planning system too. So the young aren't just feeling the pressure from one angle as when it comes to these kinds of problems. There are a number of other problems as well which are facing the younger generation. And with regard to the implicit contracts, if you like, that we have with younger people who might be expecting to retire at the age of 65 with a full state pension, I think Michael would agree here that a number of Western countries, including the United States, potentially face such huge levels of implicit government debt that there could be complete societal breakdown if we don't actually do something in order to address this problem relatively quickly. A number of Western countries, not just those that we know to be heavily indebted, such as Italy and other southern European countries, but a number of heavily indebted countries, I think, could go the way of Greece potentially.
And I just add to that those countries like France, Italy and so on have virtually no private pensions. They're trying to introduce them over the last 5 or 10 years, but they're still a tiny, tiny fraction. Basically, they are a pay-as-you-go system, so they face a much more severe problem than we do here.
Do you think perhaps the government is sending the wrong message in a country like Britain, where people can rely or think they can rely on the state pension as they grow older? They know it will be there for them, whether it be when they turn 65 or when they turn 70. There will be a state support system in place. Do you think people are relying too heavily on it and not realising they will need to do some saving earlier? Angus?
That's right. I mean, to give a lot of younger people won't know what the state pension is. It's just over £100 a week, so that's about almost £5,500 a year, about $8,000, which isn't a lot to live on. And I think most people would aspire to have more in their retirement. So we do need to do more to encourage private saving. But the government are, through auto-enrolment and nests, they are doing a lot. But as Malcolm says, it's a question of changing the culture, so that people realise they've got to save for themselves. But it's also a question of fairness, that we can't really say to the younger generation, do you mind please saving for your own pensions, and while you're at it, could you pay for the older generation who, by the way, are going to live a lot longer? So we really need to address the question of intergenerational fairness here.
Malcolm, I wanted to pick up on something you said earlier about how the state pension age won't suit all professions. You mentioned pilots and lorry drivers, but what about different regions? I mean, the Liverpool Echo has reported on George Osborne's plans fairly cynically. They've said that given the average life expectancy by the Mersey is 72.6 years, that doesn't give a lot of time for men, that is, working to enjoy their state pension if they're only retiring at 70. And now we know we've already discussed how life expectancy will increase, but won't there be a regional discrepancy with this as well?
Yes, I think there will be. And that just complicates the equations even more. How you regionalise the calculations and how you then make that fair across the country is a nightmare. But it is a case that you could well find that people living in the south of England are enjoying a very long, healthy, well-funded retirement, with people who live in Liverpool getting a couple of years and nothing more. And possibly the same in some of the areas within Scotland from some of the statistics that we've seen from there as well. Interestingly, though, the ONS figures that came out recently showed that in 2009, it was estimated that a 65-year-old man would have a 19-year life expectancy and a 65-year-old woman 21.3 years. This year's figures, that's gone down to 18.3 and 20.6. So have we seen a peak in longevity, or will it continue? And I know there's a lot of speculation across the board in terms of which one's right, but it's an interesting challenge because at the moment, going back to the point you raised in terms of how's it calculated, it will be calculated based upon longevity statistics produced by ONS. So would it theoretically be possible in years to come that the state retirement age would have to come down based on that figure?
Yes. What we've seen really is a dispersion of life expectancies, haven't we? I mean, this really is a class issue, that realistically the working class start working earlier, or manual workers start working earlier, and they die earlier, as against middle classes who, after university, start working later and have longer life expectancies. And that's a hard thing to address, except by moving nearer towards a money purchase scheme or a system that isn't rewarding those who live longer more than those who die earlier.
But if you introduce private compulsory contribution schemes such as those that exist in Australia, then those who had a lower life expectancy at retirement as a result of a known condition, or if they were smokers, or if they had heart disease or something of that nature, they would actually be able to obtain a higher income for their pension pot than those who who were in very good health, who lived in South Kensington or wherever. I say it's a paradox because those areas of the country where the problems of short lifespan are most acute, Scotland, Merseyside, etc., are not those that are likely to vote for a political party which would propose a complete privatisation of the pension system.
To come back, I think it's worth noting that, as I said before, the business cycle is extremely important, and people's mistrust of financial services is quite an important view. I mean, I see as a university professor lots of young people. They're aware that there's a serious problem about their future, but on the other hand, they don't trust what's going on. And in fact, returns in this country, in the United States and so on, over the last 5-6 years have been essentially negative for pension funds. And pension funds in Western Europe also are in serious trouble because of the crisis. Now, they were in serious trouble, strangely enough, coming up to the last bubble, the internet bubble in the late 90s, because for different reasons. But that shows, I think, that we need to look pretty severely at the financial services industry and make sure that it's doing its job properly at reasonable fees. And of course, the new regulation under the Bank of England of financial services is beginning to look at this matter. They're beginning to press down on fund managers and insurance companies and so on to actually deliver value for money, so to speak.
That's all we have time for today. I'd like to thank each of my guests for joining me here at the Voice of Russia in London. We heard from Angus Hanton, co-founder of the think tank Intergenerational Foundation, Malcolm Booth, the CEO of the National Federation of Occupational Pensioners, and Professor Michael Dempster from the Centre for Financial Research at the University of Cambridge. We were also joined by Philip Booth, Program Director at the Institute of Economic Affairs. Thanks everyone for your time.